Super.
So,
Attaway.
okay, there we go. So I hope that all of you can see this, and if you can't, just let me know. I would like to say right up front that.
Okay.
There we go. Okay, let me start again. As I go through the presentation, I'd be happy to take questions along the way, as long as we don't get too distracted, because I would like to get all the way through. The important slides, I think, which you're mostly interested in, are at the end, but I do want to offer perspective on what the Northwest Power and Conservation Council is, what our jurisdiction is, how we do our planning, and then we can get into the power plan and what we're doing to get more toward a decarbonized future. So with that, there were several questions that I was asked to address. What is the council? Again, what our jurisdiction is, how do we interact, or who do we interact with? And then we get into the meat of the discussion, which is how do we incorporate climate change into our planning process, and then what actions are we proposing? So let's begin right away. The council was created in 1980 by the Northwest Power Act, and there were 3 mandates. We are to, well, I guess we're going to get into that in a minute, but it turns out that each state legislature in the 4 Northwest states, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington, had to pass a law to form the council. Once that happened, then each state gets to appoint 2 council members for each state. So there are 8 council members. They each get an equal vote. And we are funded by Bonneville rates. Which is a bit ironic, because one of the big successes of the council was to push for cost-effective energy efficiency, which reduces the demand for electricity, and it reduces the sales and actually limits our budget. So a little bit ironic, but nonetheless, it was a good thing for us to do. So why do we have regional power planning? Just for those of you who may not remember, this is ancient history, but back in the late 70s, there was concern about not having enough power. And there were a lot of things that I wouldn't call them mistakes here. I didn't create this slide. It was given to us by one of our legal staff, but things, there are a lot of uncertainties, demand, economics, sometimes even laws and policies change things. The Washington Public Power Supply Service had 7 nuclear plants on the drawing board. Only one of them got built. And what happened back in the 70s was there was a fear that we wouldn't have enough power. A lot of utilities decided that they wanted to try to put some resources in their IRPs, integrated resource plans. And it turns out then that the council, which was created to help manage that development, ended up with a surplus, because power prices went up, demand went down, a little bit of price elasticity there. And so the idea was that it would be nice if we had kind of an oversight, sort of like a regional utility commission for the 4 states, but the only jurisdiction that we have really is over the Bonneville Power Administration. And so the council's power plan is to ensure an adequate, efficient, and economic regional power plan. And again, the major components are a forecast of regional demand, and performing a least cost with acceptable risk strategies. And of course, by statute, the only jurisdiction we have is over the Bonneville Power Administration, in the sense that any resources that they decide to acquire have to be consistent with our plan. But by tradition, the plan also serves as sort of an independent reference for regional utilities and commissions, and also by boards of directors for publicly owned utilities. We interact in the public forum always. We have regularly scheduled public meetings throughout the region, usually once a month. We also have, I think, 7 or 8 or 9 public advisory committees. I'm on the Resource Adequacy Advisory Committee. I'm a co-chair of that. But we have a load forecasting, generating resource committee, natural gas committee, et cetera, et cetera. We also are encouraged to participate in other regional, national, international forums, such as the one that I'm participating in today. But we also provide seminars at universities. We work with universities, with utilities and utility commissions. I'm also a member of a NERC subcommittee on adequacy and an IEEE resource adequacy working group. I was the chair of that for 3 years, and those are all interesting because we get to see what other people in the country do and what other people in the world do in terms of assessing and planning for power supplies. So that's kind of all of the things that we do. Jumping right into just this, I hope this is just a review for most of you, but this is just a snapshot of the power supply in the Northwest. This is the US portion of the Columbia River Basin for hydro. Of course, we're talking about, of course, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and that 1/3 of Montana, which is on the west side of the Rockies. And so based on nameplate capacity, we have nearly a little over 64,000 megawatts of capacity, which is a bit misleading because our winter peak load max has maxed out at about, I don't know, 40,000, 44,000, something like that. But we have a problem with a fuel for the hydro system. We are energy rich and capacity rich, but energy poor. The capacity of the hydroelectric system is 35,000 megawatts, but in an average year, it only produces about 16,000 megawatts. In a dry year, it produces 12,000 megawatts averaged over the year. And so there just isn't enough storage for it to run at full capacity for very long periods of time. And so this is one of the reasons that it looks impressive here. But for many, many, many years, the region has been what we call energy short or energy limited or fuel limited because of the hydro system. Most regions in the world are the opposite. They are machine limited or capacity limited because they can generally buy the fuel ahead of time. Not a problem there. So how do we plan? Let's, I think the next thing here is the power supply is changing though. You'll see that the coal here on this is about, where is coal here on this? Coal is about 8% of the total nameplate capacity, but because of policies in the 4 Northwest states, is forcing the retirement, and sometimes economics is forcing the retirement of many coal plants. One thing that I will say though, because conservation is in our name, what this pie chart does not show is that since 1980, the council has worked on developing programs and measures that have saved the region about 7,000 average megawatts of energy from conservation, basically, which is a huge amount of our demand. Our demand right now is about 21,000 average megawatts, which means that we have been able to save about 1/4. You know, if you didn't have that 7,000, it'd be about 28,000 megawatts of load. So we've been able to save about 1/4, which is a lot. That's like 7 nuclear plants, which is really, really good. It does not show up on this pie chart, but I wanted to mention that.
Where does it come from primarily? What is the primary source of saving?
Well, a lot of it was lighting. That came later. In the beginning, it was insulation and windows. Street lighting was one of the things. Appliances. And then a lot of this turned into federal standards, which helped not just us, but everyone across the country who bought a refrigerator or washer and dryer or other appliances. We actually got sued by the Seattle Master Builders Association, or they thought that our programs would add too much cost to houses and it would hurt their industry. That went all the way to the 9th Circuit, but we won. Yeah, we've been very successful. And there's a lot of other things too, in terms of for agriculture. There's more efficient pumps, and there's different changing irrigation systems from to spray systems to conserve not just energy, electricity, but also water, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole slew of things that we look at in terms of conservation, both energy and water. I hope that answered your question. If you want more detail, you can go to our site and it's spelled out in more detail.
Sometimes you are so
Okay, so as I mentioned before, a lot of fossil fuel burning generators, especially coal plants, are being shut down, retired. And this is a chart that shows from now through the end of the decade that we're going to lose more than half of our regional fossil fuel coal plant capacity. We're going to retire a little over 4,000 megawatts of coal. And then if you go into the next decade, there are more coal plants that are being retired. And so there's a concern that as we retire these generators, what are we going to replace them with? And is it going to be wind and solar? And if so, will we still have the same adequacy, because you can't control, you can't dispatch wind, you can't dispatch solar, and so forth. So we have, we take all that into account. We also obviously are connected to regions who are our neighbors, California, the west side with Wyoming and Nevada, and also Canada. And we do share in resources, although the Canadians are often in the same condition that we're in. When we have low water, they have low water. But we have used the interties quite effectively with California, because California has to build to meet their summer peak needs. And during the winter, they often have surplus capacity, which we can buy, and vice versa. Our lowest loads are in the spring or have been in the spring and summer, and we can often help out California. But things are changing. Things are changing because of laws. They're changing because of a lot of climate change too. So let's talk about climate change quickly. So this is the first year that the first time that we've actually transitioned from using historical data to do our planning okay, so call from cell phone R. Well, wait a second here. So in the past, our planning has always used historical data. For example, historical river flows from 1929 through whatever year, through 2008. And we also use historical temperatures as a guide. The temperatures are used to help us forecast demand going forward. And of course, the river flows are the fuel for the hydroelectric system. So this time around, we figured that it was more important for us to use forward-looking data, forward-looking forecasts for precipitation and river flows and for temperature and loads. And we thought it would be a better indicator of things to come, instead of using data from 100 years ago, especially if we believe that there are trends, and there appear to be trends. And so we took a result, we being actually the River Management Joint Operating Committee, which is the BPA, the Corps, and the Bureau of Reclamation, took 10 general circulation model studies done by entities and universities around the world, and they downscaled those results for the Pacific Northwest. By downscaling, we mean that they reduced the grid size to something that was usable in our models. I think down to something like about a 2 by 2 square mile region. The GCMs generally have much wider grid scales. They have to because they're doing studies for the entire globe. So this work was done by the federal agencies along with help from University of Washington and Oregon State. They used a couple different downscaling methods. They used 4 different hydrological models. In the end, we ended up with 3 out of the 80 scenarios to be representative of what we anticipate might happen over the next 30 years in terms of precipitation, potential river flows, and temperatures, and how that might affect loads. If anyone is interested, I put a link to the RMJOC report. It's rather lengthy, but if you're interested, it's a good report. So let's look at temperatures. I'm just a minute here. Just want to keep tabs on the time here. So this chart shows the average regional temperature. Well, what's that? This is a weighted. It's the temperature at the 4 largest cities in the Northwest. It'd be Portland, Seattle, Boise, and Spokane, weighted by population. And it's average for the entire year From 1948 all the way through 2019 or 2018 observed, and then the temperatures from 2021 on are forecasted from the climate change data. So there are two things that I want to point out here. One is that there's a tremendous amount of variability from year to year. That's not a surprise. But secondly, there clearly seems to be a trend here toward increasing temperatures. Okay, and what does that do to loads? Well, this chart shows for the months of the year, the dashed line shows sort of the average historical peak loads in the winter. These are not extreme, these are just the expected. So about a 32,000 megawatt load in winter, about a 28,000 megawatt load in summer. But with the temperature change, it's expected that on average, the winter peak demands will go down and the summer peak demands will go up. There's still quite a bit of variation. Our studies are done probabilistically, and so we look at a full range of future possibilities. We don't just do expected. Obviously, we don't do just expected numbers because that would give you the wrong answer, and it doesn't give you any indication of probabilities. So let's move on to the hydro side of things. Same kind of chart here. This shows the annual runoff at the Dalles in millions of acre feet. Starting in 1929 all the way through 2019, and then from 2020 forward, it's forecasted climate change river flow volume. As you can see, there really isn't an indication of any trend going up and down. We do see in the 1929 through 1933 period, there's the critical period. We had 4 really dry years back to back to back. And then we also had some low years in, you can see 1977 was the dip there. 2001 was low. And if you go into the forecasted side of things, you see about the same level of variation, but no trend. So in this case, it's not so, we don't see much of a change in the annual volume, but we see a big change in the seasonality of the volume. With increasing temperatures, even with the same amount of precipitation, we would expect that more precipitation would come down as rain in the fall and winter than snow, which means that there's more water in the river system and there's less snow in the mountains. Well, then in the spring, there's less of a spring runoff, which means that flows are going to be lower. So the anticipated change in river flows is that we expect to see higher average river flows from October through even May. And then we see lower flows in the June through, say, September period. So as you might start to get an indication of what's happening here, is that the combined effect of climate change is to decrease our loads in winter at the same time that there's more water in the river and higher amounts of accessible hydroelectric energy, which is good because we've traditionally been a winter peaking region. So that's a good thing. But the opposite happens in summer, when we anticipate that loads are going to go up because of higher temperatures, higher AC use. At the same time, we have lower flows in the river and less hydroelectric energy to use. So that's the problem. And I'll show you a graphic that shows that a little bit more, illustrates that better later. So how do we do our work? I was a part of a team that wrote this program that simulates the operation of all of the resources in the Northwest on an hourly basis. It's called the Genesis, the Generation Evaluation System Model. It was written in 1999 based on some past programs. It's a Monte Carlo program, which means that we pick a year like 2025. We simulate the operation of the entire power system on an hourly basis for the whole year, with different combinations of river flows, temperatures, and demand, different wind and solar patterns, and we of course model forced outages on the thermal units, on generators. And we, just like the term Monte Carlo means, it's like a kind of like a slot machine. For every simulation, we pull the lever and we get different combinations. We run actually something like 6,000 simulations. Each simulation has a different combination of these parameters. And then what do we do? Well, we record all the hours when we cannot serve load. And we use a metric called the loss of load probability. It's actually the annual loss of load probability. It's simply the number of years that have at least one shortfall divided by the total number of years that we simulate. And the council chose in 2011, they adopted a standard of 5% LLP, which means that the council deems the power supply to be adequate if the likelihood of having one or more shortfalls in a future year is less than or equal to 5%. It's a unique metric. I think we're the only ones that I know of in the country that are using this. And around the world, there are some other folks that are using LLP, but it's not typically an annual LLP. We are in the process of reviewing this metric. We're working with folks at NERC and at IEEE, trying to refine the measures that we use to assess adequacy so that they're a little bit more robust. But this has worked quite well for us for the last, well, we've actually been using it for the last 20 years, and it was finally adopted formally in 2011, so 10 years ago. And we use this in our planning. We have another model that we call the regional portfolio model, which is a system expansion model. The chart on the right just shows, let's see. All right, I'm having some, can you guys still hear me? It says my audio. Yeah, okay, great. So the chart on the right just shows for the years 2020 to 2041. It shows just some different load paths going forward in terms of different economic growth. We generally use about 800 simulations where we have different patterns of long-term load growth or lack thereof. And what we do is we use our adequacy standard of 5%. We convert that into an adequacy reserve margin, which basically is the amount of surplus capacity that we need to carry forward in order to ensure that we have an adequate supply. And so we use that in our expansion model. The expansion model will acquire resources if they are required under clean air laws, if they are deemed to be profitable, or the important one is if they're needed to meet the ARM threshold, or in essence, if they're needed for adequacy. And so we have this model that we plug it in, and it will give us a number of different sort of resource plans with different costs, and we pick the ones that are least cost that provide the same level of adequacy going forward. And the council then decides on which plan they want. And I've got a summary of what that looks like, I think, on the next slide, or well, in a couple of slides. I just wanted to illustrate, as I mentioned before, more the effect of climate change on resource adequacy. What I'm showing on these charts is monthly loss of load probability, not annual. And I've got it broken up into 3 segments here. So on each chart shows a monthly loss of load probability on the vertical scale, and then the months of the year across the horizontal scale. And on the very left slide, I'm showing the monthly loss of load probability based on historic data this is historic river flows and historic temperatures from 1949 through 1978. And as you can see in that chart, most of the problems that we have using that data are in the winter. No surprise, we're a winter peaking region, we were. And we still are to some degree. Now, if I do the same analysis, but using the historic data from 1979 through 2008, you start to see a shift. You start to see problems in the summer increasing, whereas problems in the winter are decreasing. This is a good indication that the effects of climate change exist in our historic record. Now we use forecasted climate change data. This comes from the downscaled global circulation models, and we see that this trend continues with winter problems decreasing and summer problems increasing. So this is just an illustration, but it's a clear illustration that the effects of climate change for the Northwest power system is that it's driving more of our needs into summer. It doesn't mean that we won't have cold snaps anymore. There are some very cold winters in our temperature forecasts from the climate change data. In fact, there's one particular year where the temperatures are colder than anything we've seen in the last 100 years, but it's only one out of 180 or so that we have. And so we always model the distribution of possibilities going forward, not expected basis. So And this is important because this makes a difference in terms of the resources that you choose to help meet your power needs. It would not be wise for us to make large investments in resources that are only available during the winter, like some kind of demand response type of programs, or something that is only effective, say, during the winter months and not effective during summer, because they're not going to be used if this trend continues. Okay, so I mentioned the power plan. The power plan was, the draft plan was just adopted or voted to be released to the public. It's not adopted, it's released to the public for public comment. There's a 60-day public comment period that I think starts today. And then we review the comments, we make some adjustments. The final plan will be adopted probably in January or February next year. But in summary, our results show that the existing power supply, even with the coal retirements, should remain adequate through 2025. But it will become inadequate with more coal retirements and with demand growth later in the decade. But the plan itself calls for a continuation of acquiring energy efficiency, another 750 megawatts by 2027, and maybe as many as 2,400 megawatts over the next 20 years. We also acknowledge that the region should develop around 3,500 megawatts of renewable resources by 2027, and more than that after that: wind, solar, biomass, distributed generation, small hydro, etc. And the region should also examine other types of products that can help keep the system adequate and reduce costs, like residential time of use rates. I think that's being done in Arizona. Demand voltage regulation, and then other types of tools like perhaps reserve products. For example, having certain resources maintain reserves strictly for adequacy, because it keeps them available and with available fuel should unexpected conditions arise where we might need to peak. This is very important in a region that is becoming where more and more renewable resources are being developed, resources that obviously you can't dispatch. And so it's important to have some resources that you can dispatch available. They don't have to run often, but if they're there for that infrequent time when perhaps the wind isn't blowing and perhaps it's cloudy, and you might have to run this resource a few hours out of the whole year, but it saves you, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to serve all of your load. So that's kind of gets us to, I think, just some links to where the power plan is. You can go to these links. We don't quite have everything up yet, but I want to point out that there is in our power plan, there is a scenario that we looked at under pathways to decarbonization. I don't have, that is not up yet. I was hoping that it would be today, but if you go, but eventually, probably later today or tomorrow or very soon, if you go to the power plan site and go to the supporting material, there should be a link to the pathways to decarbonization, where a lot of the material that I'm going to talk about today can be found. So with that, I think I'm still doing pretty good on time. I will tell you what we've done in the power plan in terms of proposals or analysis of decarbonization and things that we can do moving forward. This chart is probably familiar to many of you. This is for the US. It just shows the breakdown of greenhouse gases, with about 80% of them being carbon dioxide, but not entirely. There's obviously methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. Our analysis focuses solely on carbon dioxide. This chart shows, for the region, it shows emissions in millions of tons of CO2 equivalent in 1990, in 2005, and then projected for 2041, broken out by sectors. The transportation sector is in pink, the industrial is in light green, residential commercial in yellow, and then the electric sector is in blue, or I don't know, it's different on, I have two screens, I have two different colors. So it might be green, darker green. Not sure what you're seeing, but it's the one on the bottom. So what's interesting here is that under baseline conditions, we see that in 2041, what's projected is a very, very slight decrease in overall emissions since 2005, which is not a good thing. Even though the electric sector has decreased by about a third. So what we're doing in the power sector is great, but unfortunately under transportation, it's going up quite a bit. And in the residential and commercial sector, it's going up. And so a lot of the efforts, I mean, we can do a lot in the power industry to try to decarbonize, but even if we got that 17 down to 0, which we can't do, but even if we could, we still have a problem with emissions from these other sectors. So we'll address that in just, and that's out of the scope of our jurisdiction. So we really can't make any, we can study it, but we don't have any jurisdiction to do anything about controlling decarb or decarbonization proposals for these other sectors. Anyway, so some of the summary from this section is that if we go to electrification of transport and potentially producing hydrogen through electrolysis and using it as a fuel, it yields a 27% emission reduction by 2040, but it increases our load, our demand by 12,000 megawatts. So we're gaining reduction in emissions, but somehow we have to make up that electricity somehow. Unfortunately, because of the increase in demand and given the technology that we have today, at the council at least, we weren't able to analyze this full-blown decarbonization to 0 emission rate by 2050. That was our goal. And so in order to test the impact on strategy, we decided to take a somewhat less stringent approach, something that we think would be obtainable. And so I don't have all the details here. I wasn't the one who worked specifically on this. Again, all the details will be in that link in that scenario on the web. But the council looked at replacing some vehicles and appliances, basically electrification of cars, a higher percentage, and maybe going to electric heat as opposed to gas heat in homes, et cetera, et cetera. And our analysis shows that by 2040, this more moderate but still somewhat aggressive emission reduction increases the demand only by about 50%, and that's manageable. So, and what does that do? How do we make up that difference then? Well, these charts show how much more renewables, how much more conservation or energy efficiency, and how much more demand response we would be suggesting under this decarb scenario, modified decarb scenario, relative to the base case or the baseline, which are the lines down below. So we would be, for renewables, we would be looking at something like 30,000 megawatts of renewable solar and wind, something like, I don't know, 7,000 megawatts conservation, and something like, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 megawatts of demand response by 2040, 41. And so this is very aggressive, but it will get you closer to where we want to be. So this chart shows the Pacific Northwest emissions from all sectors combined from 1990, that's the very left column, about 150 million tons equivalent, goes up to about 175 million in 2005. And then the third column over is what the emissions would be under the baseline conditions in our plan for 2041. Not much of a reduction. But if we apply the actions that we propose in the pathways scenario, we can drop that down quite a bit to about 100. And if you go out 9 more years to 2050, we see the same pattern. And so it's a little bit, how would you say, unfortunate that under baseline conditions, it doesn't look like we really reduce carbon emissions much, even though if you break it down by sector, as you saw before, the power industry is really doing a pretty good job of reducing emissions, but unfortunately, it's the other sectors, especially in transportation, where the emissions are growing. And so if we could somehow influence, the electrification of, especially in transportation and in residential and commercial, whatever we can. And then if we plan to produce that electricity with, again, clean resources, then we can cut the emissions or the emission rate in 2050 in half, which is not zero, but it's going in the right direction. And then finally, real quick, just to check, I know I've been talking pretty quickly here, but finally, a summary of the findings. I don't think I'll read through all of these, but one sad thing is that without the very first bullet, without mitigation strategies, in other words, under the baseline condition, the region is projected to emit over 7 billion metric tons over the next 30 years, which is about the same as what the region emitted in the last 30 years, which is kind of depressing. If we do total electrification, not total, but as far as we could push, that's fine, but our load will be our demand for electricity will be 3 times what it is today. And of course, given the current technology, I'm not sure that it would be difficult to do a power plan. And I mean, there's a certain limitation on wind. At some point, you run out of sites that are available for wind and solar. And so you have to look at other technologies, batteries, perhaps more exchanges with other regions, lots of other things to deal with. But the power sector alone just can't reach zero emissions by 2050. But there's a lot of things that we can do, and we are doing. And so in conclusion, we don't address the president's goal of having the carbon emissions by 2030, but our goal was to get zero emissions by 2050. And what we discovered was that while we can do a lot with the power sector, it's not the biggest contribution to emissions. And all we can do is to suggest these other mitigating actions that we can take. For example, freeing up agricultural land, pastoral lands, etc., so we can build carbon sinks, doing things like that, doing some electrification, making sure that we're as efficient as possible in every sector, et cetera, And so it's kind of the first step in this analysis. And I should remind you that really the only jurisdiction we have is over Bonneville Power, and it's only in the power sector. And so even if we had some great ideas here, we have no means of enforcing them, but at least we can bring attention to them. And so that's kind of where we are. And I know it was kind of a short summary, but I did want to leave some time for questions. And again, we should have all of this stuff up on the web within the next couple of days so that you can see the full report. I'm happy to answer questions if there are any, or take comments.
John, would we be able to have your PowerPoint presentation to put it up on our webpage?
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll look forward to that.
I think I sent it, but I'll send it again if you need it.
Okay.
Just in case, I'll send it to you, Mike, again. Okay.
Okay, excellent.
Was your email in this on one of the slides?
I don't think it was. It is John. It is J Fazio, JFAZIO at nwcouncil.org.
Great.
Sorry, I should have that. I know I had my name on the front one. I didn't have my email. Thank you.
You do have a few chat comments, John.
Oh, okay, excellent. Let me go look. I see them now. Perfect. All right. Why does your system only study CO2? At 10% methane for the atmosphere 84. Yeah, we recognize that. That's a very good question. I think that we chose CO2 because it was sort of the low-hanging fruit, if you so to speak. We do analyze methane. For example, we look at methane releases from different sources, from leaks and from reservoirs, and we do some of that will be documented in our power plan. but we haven't done any analysis or thought about mitigating actions other than sort of just generic things like, well, yeah, if you're leaking, you know, stop the leaks as best you can, or maybe we can do something about methane that's coming from reservoirs. But basically, it was we don't have a very large staff, and so we tried to take the easiest piece to do to begin with. I know it's not a very satisfactory answer, but that's what it was. Is nuclear power being considered? It is actually. When we do our power plan, we're looking at these small modular nuclear projects. We put them in with all kinds of viable and available resources. We put in their costs, their availability, everything else, and then the model will pick the least expensive ones. It turns out that that in the near term, there's no need to develop those, at least on a regional basis. But we do know that some utilities might find that they would be cost effective for them. As we go through, as we go further in time, and if we do more electrification, small modular nuclear plants might be a very good solution in combination with more wind and solar, obviously. So we are considering them, absolutely. But they didn't turn up in the first decade out of our models because they weren't cost effective. We could do a better job of maintaining an adequate and economic supply just with renewables and energy efficiency. But as we lose more coal and as loads go up, then they may play a bigger role in the second decade and beyond that. With respect to your bottom bullet, have you estimated carbon reductions associated with these nature-based approaches? Note, I arrived late, so please forgive me if you addressed this question earlier on. I did not address it early on. It's a good question. We have not. The person who's doing this work, Masoud Jarabshi is his name. He has done a lot of research in here. I don't know the results of his research, and I'm not sure that any of it got into the power plant. So I guess my answer to this is we have looked at it. I don't think we've spent a lot of time in detail examining it. Let's see. Is there a figure that shows the distribution of power supply across the various sources, say over the last 10 years versus the nameplate capacity pie chart? Let me see if I understand the question. The distribution of power supply across the various resources versus the, oh yes, sure. What you're saying is that there's the nameplate capacity, but you want to know how much energy actually came out of each of them. Yes, I don't have a pie chart readily available, but if you go to our website, which is nwcouncil.org, and then you click on energy, there is a power supply link that will take you to some pictures of another pie chart that has energy and also a sort of historical use of those resources. What you'll see is that the amount of energy that comes out of these systems depends kind of on basically on rainfall. When we have a high water year, we have more hydro generation and less thermal generation, and vice versa when we have a dry year. And so, but yes, you can find a chart. I don't have one here, but you can go to our website. Again, www.nwcouncil.org. Go to the energy, click on the energy link, and then on the energy link, there is a link to the power supply. Okay, excellent. Does the power projections in the burden that will be driven by electric vehicles, is that included in the chart you presented showing CO2 loads in the future? It is. If you, again, I couldn't copy everything from the report in. We did a range of possible increases to load. If we do the maximum amount of electrification for electric vehicles and other electrification too, under a high case, that's where we got the projection that our peak demand would be, or that our demand would be 3 times higher. There's a chart in the actual report that shows the amount of increase in demand under different assumptions, and it ranges all the way from 25% all the way up to 300% higher, depending on the level of electrification and so forth. So I think I don't have that available to show you, but again, I would recommend that you go to the power plan, go to the supporting material, and then look for the section on the pathways to decarbonization. There's about a 20 or 30 page report there that's got all kinds of charts and descriptions of what we did. Excellent. Compared to China and Europe, your IEC to EV conversion seems slow. From what I've seen, 50% of all new vehicles sold by 2030 will be EVs. What is the fraction this plan assumes? That's a good question, and I don't know the answer, unfortunately. I read the report, and I'm not sure that the answer to your question is in the report either. But what I can do is I can talk to Masood, who put this together, and we can get that to you, and I can send that to Mike, and he can distribute it to the members. But I don't know what it is. Unfortunately, I'm sorry. Or maybe it is in the report and I just missed it, but I don't think it is. I read through it a couple times. Sorry, I can't answer this question, but we'll get back to you on that one. Am I aware of the AR6 declarations of an emergency methane leakage? I am not, actually. Have not heard of that. I'm interested in knowing more about it. Either now or if whoever, let's see, Ed asked this question. If you can email me some information or a link or something, I'd be happy to take a look at it. I'm not aware of this, sorry. If you want to add something. Okay. From Mike, we will likely wind up with an excess of energy in the winter and a deficit in summer. California has excess of energy solar midday. Do you consider adding transmission to move more energy south to north? That's a very good question. Yes, we do see this pattern. In fact, we see a pattern of having not just a ton of energy during the middle of the day in the summer, but negatively priced energy in the middle of the day. And so we understand that transmission could be part of the solution, but in all of our analysis, we did not look into increasing transmission between the north and south. However, a consulting firm, E3, did some work for, I think, California ISO on what increasing transmission, increasing the interties would do. I don't have a link to that report, but if you do a search for E3 or California ISO and transmission expansion, I think you can get the report, and they do a pretty good analysis of the cost benefit analysis of maybe increasing the interties between the north and the south. The only problem is that their analysis only used historical data to assess the northwest position, which is a little bit off, as you noticed from my slides today. But nonetheless, it's still a pretty good report. So I would recommend that you take a look at that. But we did not examine that. Next question is, let's see, from Ed. When we listen to offshore wind information, it seems to say we could get as much high reliability energy from there as we could possibly use, but it all has to get distributed. Well, that's true. We look at both onshore and offshore wind as part of it's in our resource expansion package. Of course, we put in all the costs associated, and for offshore wind or for onshore wind and or solar, we have to include the cost of transmission and getting it to the demand sites. And so when we put in the offshore wind, it did not come up as, at least in the first decade, actually not even in the next 20 years, I don't think, as a cost-effective resource to add. But if we proceed with electrification and our loads go up, it, like modular nuclear projects, could show up. And I think that might be one of the next steps, is for us to do a more detailed analysis of electrification and try running it again and seeing if these resources pop up in there as being cost effective under those conditions. So yes, when we do consider transmission costs, when we look at all of these potential new resources. From Michael, NREL has estimated Oregon's offshore wind resource potential at 62 gigawatts. I'm not surprised. The East Coast has more than 30 gigawatts of offshore wind. How much offshore wind is included in our, well, what we have is we don't have any offshore wind in the results in our proposal. I don't think. Well, actually, I'm not sure of that. I shouldn't say that. We do have a chunk of wind as a part of the 3,500 megawatts by 2027. I don't think any of that is offshore, but like, as I said before, we do include it as one of the potential. We put it in as a supply curve. When we run our system expansion model, it has access to it knows about all of these possible resources and all of their costs, and then it will choose the most cost-effective resource to fill in the gap. And I don't think that offshore wind shows up in the first decade. I'm not sure if it shows up in the second decade. Again, I would refer you to the power plan. I can see if I can dig that up and get that to Mike also. It's a huge report, and I don't work directly on some of this. I get the data, I plug it all in, and I do my specific function is to assess the adequacy of the power supply. So I don't know all of these answers, but it's a good question. Yes, absolutely. Does the plan consider the potential loss of generation from the, no, the plan does not, but we have done that before. We've done those studies. The 4 lower Snake River dams have a capacity of about 3,000 megawatts. They produce about 1,100 average megawatts of energy per year. They have roughly somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 megawatts of what we call sustained peaking capability. Because of the biological opinion, the Endangered Species Act and the Recovery Plan, which is basically called the biological opinion, their operation during the summer is very limited. It's limited to 1.5 feet of pool operation, and a lot of it is spill. In some cases, more than half of the water that goes through is spilled around the turbines. And so right now their contribution in the summer is not great. So the removal of those projects for the summer probably wouldn't affect things too much. But in the winter, we do still use their full pool range, which is about 3 to 5 feet. And so we anticipate that the council may ask us to do a specific study to see how the removal of those projects will affect our resource strategy and what those costs might be. And that will happen probably early next year. We've done similar studies in the past. The thing to note is that we don't have to replace them 1-for-1 nameplate capacity. Obviously, we don't even necessarily need to replace them 1-for-1 energy-wise, but we do want to make sure that there is an adequacy standard. When we remove those projects, we want to make sure that, and we replace them with whatever replacement resources we have, that we maintain the same level of adequacy. And so I don't have an answer for you right now. I just gave you some statistics about what they contribute to the power supply. It looks like if we were to replace them with a thermal, like gas plants, it looks like we could probably get away with adding about 700 to 1,000 megawatts of gas plants that would cover it. But that's a very rough estimate based on some past studies that we've done. But of course, we wouldn't build gas resources to replace them. What we'd probably do is to increase the renewables and push some of the other clean resources to replace them. And so that would be the challenge. And we haven't done that study yet, but we hope to. So I hope I think I got everybody's questions. I know I wasn't able to answer all of them to everyone's satisfaction, but if I don't know, I'll just tell you I don't know, but I can look it up. And so I think we have a little more time. Well, not much, just a couple minutes, but I'd be happy to take another question if there is one.
Ron, did you get your questions answered?
No.
Go ahead, reiterate that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Stated.
I saw a question about nuclear waste.
Nuclear waste? Did I miss it? I apologize if I missed it. Oh yes, my fault. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to skip you. Sorry. How do we deal with nuclear waste, and what do we know about zinc air batteries and other batteries? Okay, well, let's see. Actually, we don't deal with nuclear waste. There's one nuclear plant in the region right now. If you're talking about nuclear waste from the small modular plants, I don't know. I suppose that we'd have, for the time being, because there's no federal depository for that there would be some sort of at-site storage facilities for those, but I don't know. I really don't. I'm not qualified to answer that question. But we don't have any of those showing up in our power plant over the next 20 years, at least in our baseline scenario. If we go to electrification and they start to show up, then that's something that we probably have to deal with. But my guess is that it would be some kind of at site sort of a storage facility, because there's no other place to go with it right now. As far as zinc air batteries, I'm not an engineer. I don't really know very much about it, but we are obtaining as much information about all kinds of batteries as we can. The issue with batteries in the Northwest is that we have a huge battery in the hydroelectric system. We can store, in the US system, we can store about 25 million acre feet of water, which is, it's hard to translate that into power, but it's roughly something like 2,500 megawatts of power that essentially is a battery. And so if you are trying to build a battery, say a 200 megawatt battery, it's going to be tough to compete with the hydro system because we already have this huge battery, which the limitations are diminishing over time because of additional constraints that are being placed on the operation of the hydro system. But nonetheless, batteries can be very cost effective, especially in areas that don't have access to hydro storage. And as far as zinc air batteries, I quite honestly, I don't know how they would compare to other batteries, but we encourage the development of batteries, and obviously moving forward, I think batteries in combination with these variable energy resources together are going to be a good combination. So I think we're going to see them becoming more and more cost effective, especially as their costs come down, and as price of electricity goes up. So I'm sorry that I don't know anything about zinc batteries, and we don't deal with nuclear waste. And sorry that I missed you. Didn't mean to. Did I miss anybody else?
John, I see one more question about time of use, implement time of use rates. Would that change? How would that affect things?
Well, that would affect things by reducing the, essentially you're shaving the peak, hoping to get some of the electricity that would have been used during the peak hours and moving it into hours where we have less demand. That will decrease the amount of peak capacity capability that you need. And so that might be a more cost-effective way than building some kind of a peaking plant. In essence, with time of day use, you might be able to avoid having to say build some kind of a peaker, say 100 megawatt or 200 megawatt peaker, which of course would be extremely helpful in terms of decarbonization if that peaker turns out to be a gas plant or some kind of a plant that emits carbon dioxide. So we're exploring that. I don't know whether it would be implementable in the Northwest. I know that they do it in Arizona.
Mike Minton, would you like to add a couple words about ammonia from hydrogen and reuse of methane turbines and with that?
We do get people who come in and talk to us about different kinds of methods using, for example, using surplus wind power to create, they use it to essentially make fertilizer. And that it's an interesting concept, along with other options like that. Creating hydrogen through electrolysis is something else, but there are costs involved, there are losses involved, and in things that we've seen so far, none of them have come up as being cost-effective alternatives to the resources that we've chosen, but we do look at all of them. Some of them, in order for us to put a resource into our plant, it has to be not just cost-effective, but it has to be viable. In other words, it has to be something that can actually be acquired. And in some of these cases, I think we would consider them still as under development. and maybe not as viable as we'd like them to be. And so, but we are open to suggestions. We get people and come talk to us about all kinds of ideas about how to store energy or how to get energy from different sources. And we encourage that. And then to the extent that we can, we take the data, the efficiency, the costs and all that, and other parameters, and we plug them in. And if they end up in the mix, then they're there. If not, then at least we tried. And again, I'm not, we do have a person who's a resource specialist who deals with that. We have a person who does loads. We have a person who does wind and solar. My job is taking all that data and plugging it into my model and running it. So I don't know very much about the specifics about these resources. I apologize for that. But I know how they, I know how they all work together to make sure that electricity goes to the demand or whether it doesn't. And then I measure that. So, again, to the extent that you can, if you can go to our website, if you can find your answers there. If not, I'd be happy to take emails and try to answer your questions one-on-one, or I can send them to the group.
Well, thank you, John, for your time.
Oh, you bet. My pleasure.
You've given me a lot to think about. I know that. And if anyone has, as John said, a burning question, send it to John or send it to myself and I'll forward it to John. And with that, if you want a PDH hour here, please email me and I'll respond as soon as I can. Thank you, John.
You bet. My pleasure.